Afternoon. My name is Will Valley. I'm Associate Professor of Teaching in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia. I use he, him pronouns, and today I'm presenting on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people in what's currently known as Vancouver, British Columbia. So I've been asked to record a brief video about case studies and case studies in sustainable food systems education. So the next 20 minutes or so, I'll briefly answer some of the questions that were sent to me and give some examples of who we're working with, why we use case studies, and maybe dig a bit deeper into one of the case studies that we have on our website before ending with a bit of advice for developing new case studies. So first, the undergraduate students that are in our faculty, they come from degrees and majors across the food system. So plant science, soil science, animal science, agroecology, nutritional science, food science, dietetics, community nutrition, food market analysis, food resource economics, across the whole scope of the food system. And in interesting ways, so not only do the students and the degrees and the majors come from across the food system, also faculty's research and interests are also part of our faculty. So their research interests are also coming from diverse parts of the food system. And we also have these case studies I'm going to talk about today are also designed with students from across the campus in mind, because we have a minor in sustainable food systems, and so some students will be encountering these case studies through the minor program, as well as, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, why we started developing these case studies, is that not just in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, but across the campus, there's lots of interest in bringing food into the classroom or topics of food to explore other disciplinary ways of knowing as well. So the undergraduate students for the Center of Sustainable Food System are across the campus, but predominantly focused in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. Our learning team composition, and I'm noticing I've got a bit of a spelling error here, learning team composition. The composition of our learning team, again, comes from across the food system. So we have faculty members with backgrounds in nutrition, in dietetics, sociology, education, agroecology, as well as undergraduate and graduate students who were a part of this project. And we also had input from campus staff, so those who manage campus food systems, the retail side as well as the procurement side, and community partners external to the university. And even actually some student organizations on campus that, in particular, the ones that run our one of our urban agricultural demonstration gardens, they were a big partner in this as well. So why case studies? Really important study. Why bring this way of knowing, this way of learning into a food systems education program? Well, the first thing we like to distinguish, and we talk to our students about this right at the beginning of their journey in our faculty, at the beginning of their a degree program, is that we like to distinguish between well and ill-structured problems. So a well-structured problem is often also described as like a complicated problem, and so it's not an easy problem by any stretch of the imagination, but they are defined as having an easily, or not easily, I should say, the capacity to define what the problem is, the capacity to usually have an expert who knows how to address these types of problems, as well as the capacity at the end of the process of addressing or fixing a problem, you can say at the end that, yes, we fixed this problem. So an example I often give is with a laptop. So I know when my laptop is broken for the most part, or I can show a colleague and I say, hey, do you think this laptop is broken? And they'd say, yeah, it doesn't turn on, it's not working. Like, okay, so the problem is my laptop's broken, and I don't need to be an expert to know it. But I certainly don't have the expertise to fix it, but someone does. So I take it to get repaired. There's someone who has an advanced understanding of how these things work, and they can fix it. And at the end, they can show me, a non-expert, that the problem is fixed. And then I can show someone else, and they can say, yes, this problem is fixed. So that's kind of the structure of a well-structured problem, is that it's definable. There's often someone who knows how to fix it, although that might not be an easy solution or easy process, but someone can fix it, and at the end, we can agree that it's fixed, even if I'm not an expert in that process. So that's a well-structured problem, and the world is full of well-structured problems, and much of our education system is designed around getting our students to understand how to address well-structured problems. However, increasingly in food systems, we're acknowledging, because of the complexity of food systems, that there are a lot of ill-structured problems, such as food insecurity, world hunger, environmental degradation at the expense of maximizing crop production. There's all these complex problems that are better categorized as ill-structured problems. And we tell our students that if you're going to graduate with a degree from our university, you're likely going to be employed to address ill-structured problems. So the role of a professional in society is to address ill-structured problems. And so what makes a problem ill-structured is that it's hard to agree what is the problem here. So if we take an example of school food systems or menu planning for a school food, elementary school, we can say, okay, this current menu we need to improve, but what is the problem? Is the problem that it costs too much? Is the problem that we don't have the facilities to create the menus we want? Is the problem that we don't have culturally appropriate food on this menu? Is the problem that the food that we're bringing in not sustainably sourced? So what is the actual problem with the menu? And so all of this initial issues really depends on your perspective as a stakeholder and your values. So it's hard to define what the problem really is to a certain degree of certainty, but we also have to work on these issues. So we have to work on these ill-structured problems, and so we begin the same journey as trying to fix. But throughout this process, we don't really know if we're actually fixing the problem, because it was hard to define what the problem really was, and we don't even know if we have the right people or perspectives at the beginning to help us define it. So an ill-structured problem, it's hard to define at the beginning, it's really hard to work through, and often there's really no end. We usually have to end the projects when funding runs out or relationships burn out or moving on. But ill-structured problems are actually defined by their never ending. They're always something we're approaching, we're addressing, we're working on, but we're never really solving these types of problems. And so well-structured versus ill-structured problems is the first way we talk about how we're going to use case studies and how we kind of frame some of the learning and the learning activities we use in our degree program, so students understand that we'll distinguish between different ways of approaching different types of problems. And it also it ties into how we talk to our students about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, so why they need to learn at the very beginning stages of their degree how to work with students and eventually their own colleagues that are from different disciplines. So why a soil scientist needs to know how to and why to work with a nutrition student, and for any other discipline that we have within our faculty, we emphasize that certain problems in the food system aren't in any of your domains. So you need to know how to work together, because collectively you're more likely to address these problems, and that's what will be expected of you upon your graduation. So these are messy problems. So the ill-structured problems, both well and ill-structured problems, lend themselves well to case studies. So how do we illustrate this to our students in a way that we can offer them an activity or something to get them to work through these types of problems that they're going to encounter upon graduation? And also this comes back to one of the ideas of what is the role of a professional, or what are we trying to develop for our students upon graduation. And one thing that we like to think about is helping them develop the capacity to make judgments under uncertainty. So learning to deal with uncertainty in the classroom models one of the most crucial aspects of professionalism, namely the ability to make judgments under uncertainty. So we tell our students, with this degree, you're likely to be employed in a way that expects you to be able to make judgments under uncertainty. And so for us, this is where case studies come in. And then we further distinguish between closed versus open case inquiries. So a close-ended case study, they're designed in a manner that allows the student to discover the correct solution, which is already known by the instructor. So you create a scenario that has a bunch of different elements to it, but there are one or two pathways that will lead students to the correct answer. And perhaps this is a historic example or a version of a historic example, but really the instructor knows that there's a correct answer and they want the students to reach that outcome. And success will be defined by reaching that outcome. Or one of the most important parts of reaching that outcome is, did they find the right answer? The interesting part about this, especially students in an undergraduate program, they're used to this type of they're used to this type of close-ended case studies, and it also shifts how they approach working individually or collaboratively on addressing these problems, because they know that if you're the instructor, they know the instructor knows the answers, and they know that they're responsible for finding out what the instructor knows. So they have all these sorts of techniques and ways of getting to the right answer that are kind of how they've survived being in and socialized within these educational systems. So this isn't to say that closed-ended case studies aren't useful. They're very useful, especially at that beginning part of as like novices learning to become more advanced and develop their expertise. Closed-ended case studies provide a level of certainty and a level of structure in order to then encounter what are open-ended case studies. So open-ended cases, they more model the uncertainty of professional work, and they're suited for developing processes of collaboration among the instructor and maybe a community or an industry stakeholder and students. So acknowledging that neither the relevant questions nor the answers have been yet identified. So they're much more open. They're much more like an ill-structured problem where we have some of the beginning materials of the issue, but students are responsible for demonstrating how they encounter and define problems, how they work through it, how they demonstrate reflection on knowing that what they're working on might not be right, but they're still working through it, and they're going to at a certain point report back what they found. So the open-ended case inquiry more models an ill-structured problem, and it provides students with an opportunity to apply previous skills, such as the ability to incorporate contextual knowledge when framing questions. Maybe they identify leverage points within a system, and they're practicing effective collaboration with diverse stakeholders. So these are the skills that they can bring into and apply and develop in an open-ended case inquiry. They're similar to, but a little bit different than a closed-ended case inquiry, where everyone knows that there is one answer that they're all trying to strive for, and it changes the nature of the learning. And so at another time with another, I'd love to talk more about this, but it's the idea of cognitive flexibility, kind of put forth by Spiro and colleagues back in the late 80s. This idea that developing cognitive flexibility by looking at open-ended case inquiries is a way to support students' capacity to then transfer elements of their knowledge or their skills to different contexts. So helping students recognize that the problems that they'll be working on in a course or throughout their degree programs are not going to be the exact same problems that they're going to be working on when they leave the university. And at a certain level, they understand that. But at the same time, we often get them used to and developing their identity around solving certain types of problems. And then when they're placed into a new context, they can feel overwhelmed and uncertain, like they don't know what to do. So the open-ended case inquiry recreates that uncertainty for them in a safer space through these case studies. It allows them to get a sense of, okay, this is what it feels like to not really know if I'm on the right pathway, but I can rely on these types of skills and these strategies to keep myself grounded and keep myself certain that I'm getting somewhere, even though I know fundamentally that this is ultimately an ill-structured problem and there's no final solution. So that's how we distinguish between closed-ended and open-ended case inquiries, and I think that's my last little distinction before I kind of jump into the next part of the questions that I was asked to answer. So the question is, how did the idea to develop case studies come up? So this particular case study is at UBC that I'll show the website in a second, from the Center for Sustainable Food Systems. It emerged because we'd often get requests to do farm tours. So we have a campus farm, 24 hectares. There's some chickens, but mostly it's ground crops. And there's some forested area, and there's some children's garden and educational programming. There's indigenous gardens. There's lots going on, and folks from around UBC often ask, instructors will say, I want to bring food into my classroom. Can I have a tour of the farm as a way to get my students to understand what food production might look like, or to get them to be in that place and to be in the space so that we can learn more about and talk more about food. But what we were noticing is that the farm tour doesn't really meet all of the needs. So often folks request a farm tour, but really that's not the best learning activity for their learning objectives, learning outcomes. And in many ways, although I think some of the farm tours are fantastic, and actually most of them are fantastic at a certain level, but they're also in some ways quite passive experiences where students kind of walk around, they ask questions, they're in the space, and it's lovely. But is it really getting at those higher order learning skills and the higher order capacities? So to kind of go beyond the farm tour, and also because we couldn't respond to all the requests to do farm tours, we applied for some funding to develop these case studies to look at other food system assets on campus that we could offer with some guiding questions, with some framework to instructors. So when they said they would like a farm tour, we'd say, possibly, have you checked out these case studies that we've developed here that look at other food system assets on campus? So I'm jumping ahead of my slides a bit, but here's the case studies and learning modules at this from our website, and here's the website down here as well. If you just Google case studies UBC Farm, it'll pop up. And you'll see that we have right now 5 different case studies up there. So dining environments on campus, ethnobotany, so looking at the different types of plants that the native and introduced non-native plants on campus, and mushrooms as well, and how they can be used and how they can be how they relate to different fields of knowledge and different disciplines. Indigenous food sovereignty, I'll jump into this one a little bit later. UBC Farm itself through a sustainability lens, so looking at how the UBC Farm measures up in terms of its practices, its outputs, its impacts with regards to sustainability, as well as urban agriculture, because we have a number of, apart from the farm, which is on campus, we have a number of other smaller urban farms, gardens and food producing spaces on campus. And so we also highlighted one of those as a way to get students to engage with and look at the urban, because UBC campus is quite urban, the urban landscape through a food and agricultural lens. So when the question is, when you define a subject to work with, how is the process? What process do we use to elaborate the case study? And so I will. I'll just choose one example of one of the case studies and tell you a little bit about the story of how we developed it. But first, we feel really fortunate that we're in food systems or food-related disciplines, because we find food to be the grand connector. Food is a way to connect to anything and to everything, which can be quite overwhelming, but also such an opportunity. So no matter what type of food system asset we look at, we can always find ways to connect it back to a discipline, a troubling or a challenging issue in society, or an interesting and engaging topic that would draw students into the food system, but also into their discipline or whatever the learning outcome might be for the particular course. So how we approach this, because we were trying to give alternatives to the farm tour, we identified food system assets on campus that students could physically visit. So we really wanted to make it a place-based learning experience and an experiential opportunity. So when we developed these case studies, we wanted them to be able to go somewhere, to talk to someone, or at least to see a recorded video of the people who are in there, and to engage with all their senses. So the smells, the sounds, the sights, everything beyond just learning in a lecture hall. So trying to bring in some of the elements of the farm tour that are impactful, so being in the space, but then linking it to different types of assets. So we, you'll see in these case studies, we have used some of the retail spaces, so getting students to go into the retail spaces with certain lenses and questions, urban agriculture, the campus itself and its landscapes, as that through the ethnobotany one, as well as the indigenous food sovereignty one. So we're looking at food system assets that are on campus, that are public, students have access to, and then how we'd build the cases from around that. So we always ask ourselves, like, what story can this food system asset tell through us? So what are the possibilities that by being in this space, what can we leverage by being here and talking to the people and witnessing the activity and the flow of materials and energy and sounds and sights and cultural practices, and who's in these spaces and why? What story can that tell? And how can we tell that? And also, we love to think about, like, what is hidden in plain sight, because so much of our food systems often become second nature or operating at a level kind of below our intentions. That what can we bring out of these case studies that would bring an interesting twist to something that's in plain sight. So then, when students go to similar assets throughout their life, throughout their city, throughout wherever, they're reminded of the learnings and the opportunities to think differently about this particular food system asset. And then the last part we also like to think about is, what is the dominant narrative here? What is the usual story? And how can we interrupt that story? And how can we ask students to interrogate, where does that story come from? Who tells this story? Who benefits from this being the dominant story in this space? So when we think about the campus as, or urban agriculture on the campus, there's a lot of pushback of, why would we bother growing food in these marginal spaces? Why not just plant some plants, or better yet, maybe more parking lots, or something that's more functional, something that provides a different service to more people. So we'll often ask our students, and we'll choose the topics to say, okay, what are the alternatives? What are different perspectives on this issue? On the ethnobotany tour and case study, who's choosing the plants that are dominating our landscape at UBC? Why do we have so many boxwoods, which is a particular plant kind of in the laurel family? Who's deciding to plant all these boxwood? Why is there so much lawn everywhere? Who makes these decisions? Also, have you noticed that there are native plants and they have medicinal uses? They have they make wonderful teas. Some of them are very, like some of our, like our Douglas fir, Pseudotsyga menzii is the species name. It makes a lovely tea, and it has like a light citrus hint to it, but it's also full of vitamin C, and it's everywhere on campus. There's wild blueberries on campus. There are many plants that are non-native to Vancouver, but have different properties and have different stories to tell, but aren't cultivated by the landscapers, aren't chosen by someone to be a part of the landscape, but they're there anyways. So those are the types of case studies we like to think about in the food system. Like, what's the dominant narrative here? Who's behind that dominant narrative? Which culture? Who's in power that helps maintain these dominant narratives? And then what are the alternatives? What are the harms? What are the power imbalances? And whose voices are left out of these stories? Not just human voices, but other than human voices as well. So we really like this pattern of like interrupting and interrogating, providing alternatives as well in our case studies. And so when you look at our case studies, you'll see this similar format, a little bit about like the overarching details, and that's where we'll list like we think this topic is suitable, and the themes that we've presented are suitable for students in history or political science or agroecology, nutrition. We'll give some guidelines on how to use this case study. Often we'll talk about when things are open or who to contact if you want to talk to someone in this particular space. And then it goes to the usual bit of an introduction, a bit of a hook into why it's important, and then we try to break it down into different themes. And within each theme, we're always taking an interdisciplinary lens, but we'll also try to kind of narrow it down and say a bit more specifically, and we'll bring in readings and questions and content related to these different themes, so that instructors could say, oh yeah, I want to bring in more Indigenous foodways. So where do I start? Okay, so this theme 1 here would be good for acknowledging Indigenous foodways. So what we have in Vancouver or in Canada, although it's changing slightly, is often and especially among international students who arrive to Canada to go to school here at UBC, they're not aware of the recent history of colonization and how it's ongoing on campus. And so, well, actually, I'll jump into this in a second, but it's we try to make these themes in a way that allow people to say, oh, I teach policy, or I'm interested in from an anthropological lens, or intercultural engagement. So we choose these themes that might draw the attention of specific disciplines on campus. And I should back up a little bit first here and say that all of the case studies we designed, we first asked the past group of many instructors who had been requesting tours at our farm, and we asked them, what are you interested in? What types of learning outcomes would you like? What type of topics would you like us to cover, or what types of topics would you like to bring in through food? And then we designed some of the case studies around that too. So we did some some inquiry among our stakeholders who we knew were interested in bringing food in, and then we used what they told us to design our case studies as well. I should have mentioned that part, an important part of the process. Knowing that we didn't, there's a popular movie in the United States around 1980 called Field of Dreams. We didn't want to build it and hope people would come. We actually talked to those who we knew were interested in this, and then we built our case studies around their interests. So not doing the Field of Dreams model. All right, so the example of our Indigenous food sovereignty case study. So the objectives of this case study are to investigate the colonization and transformation of traditional regional food systems, land rights and access, and pathways to decolonizing research and relationships. Students can learn to identify and understand the tensions, the contradictions, and challenging ways forward towards better understanding Indigenous peoples' food systems and how they interface with other expressions of food systems in mainstream culture. So this image here is of the reconciliation poll that was raised recently on campus at UBC, acknowledging the history and legacy of residential schools. and the impact on Indigenous communities across Canada and their survivors, and the survivors and the children, since the schools closed down in 1996. But the impacts and legacy is ongoing of this form of cultural and physical genocide. And so the campus that UBC, the land that UBC Vancouver campus is on, and UBC Okanagan, is unceded territory. That means it was never given over. It was never lost in war. It was never signed over through treaties. It was just occupied by the white settlers that came, at the end of the 19th century, and just slowly pushed the Indigenous, the First Nations, so the Musqueam community for UBC, into reserve systems and took over. And so a lot of students aren't aware of that recent history, aren't aware of the implications of it. And in particular for our students who are trying to learn about sustainable food systems, sustainable agriculture, sustainable diets, they don't recognize that food in Canada, food around Vancouver on small scale farms or sustainable farms, or in businesses or retail spaces that are promoting ethically produce, ethically source, ethical labor in their food system, they don't realize that all of this is ongoing on stolen land, on land that was taken away from Indigenous peoples, often forcefully, often through acts of violence and ongoing forms of violence. And so this particular case study was designed around that as well. How do we raise that initial awareness? Like, this is what happened and is still happening. And how does that impact food systems? How does that impact what we even conceive of as food system assets? And so again, coming back to that interrupt and interrogate, this particular case study is meant to initially say, look, we have a dominant food system that is recent, the past 100 years, past 50 years in this part of the world. But we consider it to be the only type of food system that's conceivable. However, for millennia, there was other food systems. There was other distinct food systems with distinct trade patterns, distinct ways of engaging with the land, different from the industrial, capitalist, Western, techno-scientific food system that we have right now. And so most of our students have never even considered alternative food systems. And so this is one way to both acknowledge the harms and violences, the historical and ongoing harms and violences that the settler state of Canada is creating relative to the Indigenous people, and also to introduce to our students that other forms of food systems still exist, and that they need to know about them, and that if they're going to be professionals in the food system, they need to be aware that their way of knowing is limited, and what they think about food systems is also limited. Not necessarily wrong in some ways, but limited. And so that's a big part of this particular case study, is that we worked with an Indigenous collaborator, Don Morrison, on the topic of Indigenous food sovereignty. What does Indigenous food sovereignty mean? What does it look like? What is it in practice? And so we based most of this case study around the campus as unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We focused on the book chapter and an audio recording between the two authors, Hannah Whitman, a sociologist in our faculty, and Don Morrison, about what are the possibilities for reconciliation and moving forward, and what are the benefits from understanding and working towards a decolonized food system in Canada, and what are the challenges, contradictions, and tensions. And so from there, the sky's the limit in terms of how we connect back to the different disciplines. It's a very fertile ground in terms of offering students different ways of thinking about and approaching their degree, their understanding of the land, their understanding of food systems, whose food systems matter, the power imbalances, the inequalities, and the challenges of moving away from a colonial food system that is also slowly colonizing the rest of the world, and seeing how that implication at a global scale is playing out beyond Canada, beyond North America, and what are the outcomes, and how are they being distributed, the benefits and the harms, who is benefiting and who continues to be harmed by these ways of thinking about these food systems. So this is kind of how we start with the case study, wanting to acknowledge that we are on unceded territory, on stolen land, and that the foodways and the food systems that the Musqueam people had, and the Coast Salish, Interior Salish, and all the numerous communities within what's currently called British Columbia, their food system still exists, elements of it. Their populations are also undergoing intense forms of oppression through colonization that's led to intergenerational poverty and malnutrition and obesity and all these things. But at the same time, their food systems still exist, and they are resisting and they are resurging in how they're bringing it back within Canada, so-called Canada. So that's a little bit about this case study, a little bit how we thought about it and framed it, but also how we use the campus itself as one of the main points of expression for this particular case study. And so in there you'll see, and if you click on the links, it'll give you some much more further information about acknowledging Indigenous food ways, kind of the first step, acknowledging that they exist, that they're important, that the current food system has a dominant industrial capitalist food system, isn't the only food system, and there are alternatives. But then looking at what are the policy implications and how do we learn differently if we were to take this seriously, as well as how then do we do intercultural engagement through food and food systems, and how do we work towards Indigenous food sovereignty as non-Indigenous people and as future professionals within the food system. So quickly, I'll wrap up some advice. I'd say with case studies, I mean, it depends on the type of case study, but I'd say what is the benefit of all case studies is it allows us to ask our students to identify the process. What is the process that you are applying to address the issues that are presented within this case study? Not so much the outcomes at times. I mean, for closed-ended case studies, the outcome is very important. However, an emphasis on process and being able to communicate how you approach this problem is one of the most beneficial parts of using case studies in a classroom setting. So focusing on process is kind of like my partner's a math teacher, and so in her work, she says to her students, you have to show your work. And it's the same sort of thing with these case studies. You have to show your work. And we want to see how you're approaching this problem, because we know that you're not going to get this exact same problem when you leave. But what we need to know is how you're approaching it, and we can give you feedback on that. The next part, because like sustainable food systems and nutrition is characterized by a high degree of uncertainty, because of the dynamic and conjectural nature of food systems and food system knowledge, we always try to tell our students, and we try to model this, that what we're learning in our universities, what you're learning in your courses, and what we're learning through our research, through the scientific process, isn't the final word, isn't the final truth, capital T. It's just to the best of our knowledge at present time. So the knowledge in food systems is just the best of our knowledge at the present time. And so we want them to recognize that they shouldn't be attached to learning all the facts. They should be attached to learning how to learn, learning how to work through issues. And so with that, we often we try to model real-time engagement with uncertainty. So as the instructors, as the people at the front of the classroom, the authority in the classroom, so to say, the expert, we bring in open-ended case studies and ill-structured problems so we can model what it looks like to think through these challenging issues. If solving world hunger was a well-structured problem, we would have solved it a long time ago, but it's not a well-structured problem. Food insecurity is not well-structured, they're ill-structured. So we try to model how to wrestle with these tensions and contradictions in how we approach our research and our teaching to address these really fundamental issues in our food systems. So we encourage you to model it and to show students what it looks like to say, I don't know. Here's what I think would be the best approach, but even that has its limitations. So perhaps we need to ask someone else, or perhaps we need to go back to some of our assumptions so we can better understand if we're on the right pathway. So modeling that for students is a really important part and opportunity of presenting case studies in your teaching practice. And again, to reiterate that it's developing ways of thinking, not what to think. So a big part of food systems education these days is that acknowledging the complexity, acknowledging the uncertainty, and acknowledging that what we know right now might not help us in 10 years' time. So we try to emphasize to our students that through these case studies, through these case projects, we're trying to help them develop a way of thinking, not trying to tell them what to think. And if they think they're here to learn what to think, they're kind of missing the point. The point of education, I think in food systems education in particular, is to develop habits of mind and habits of being so that you can apply it and continue to reflect on how you're learning, how you're showing up to address the new problems that are going to be coming up in the future as we address some of the confluences of climate change, pandemics, ecological instability, wildfires in our part of the world. So there's so much uncertainty coming up that we want our students to develop these ways of thinking and not what to think. And so the last thing I'd say is that's scaffolding. So coming back to close-ended and open-ended, we start with close-ended cases. So we first give students and we tell them, this is a close-ended case study. Here's the material, but we're looking for specific outcomes, and we know them. So you'll be graded on more on if you get to the outcome, but we want to hear a little bit about how you got there. And so we'll start with that as a model, and we'll give them some pathways to work from. And so that's part of the feedback is okay, here's the pathway, here's what you missed, here's what you got right, and here's how it impacted your conclusions. But around the third year, we tell them that we're intentionally shifting to open-ended case studies. So these are we're giving you problems, we're creating problems. Actually, we're receiving these problems from our community partners, from our industry partners, and we don't know the answer. You're actually responsible for generating knowledge through this process. You're also responsible for managing your interpersonal relationships within your collaborative groups, for managing your own affective space, so your emotional journey when you're encountering uncertainty. Because we know that the first few years at UBC, in our science program, in our food, in our natural science program, students are developing a way of seeing the world that is kind of trying to eliminate uncertainty. However, by third year, we're asking them, or actually, we're not actually asking them, we're saying there's no way to eliminate uncertainty. You need to learn to embrace uncertainty. You need to learn to work through uncertainty. That's what's expected of you if you get a degree here. And that's what these cases and projects will prepare you for. And so we'll do it in a way where we start with closed case studies to get used to the process, to use the method, but by third year, we're switching to almost exclusively open-ended case studies in the courses I teach and in the courses that I'm responsible for, and some of my colleagues, so that students can get used to problem solving under uncertainty and getting used to the fact that at the end, they might not have gotten anywhere, but they can tell us how or what they've done and why they did what they've done, and they can still receive a good mark. They can still receive lots of knowledge and skills that they can apply later, but they might not have come to the final solution that they thought they might have, which is okay. So we try to uncouple them from certainty and getting them used to working collaboratively under uncertain conditions, so that they can make those judgments when they become professionals in the food system. And so a little bit of this process is from a paper that we published in 2018. Myself and some colleagues, as an emerging signature pedagogy for sustainable food systems education, and it's in the Journal of Renewable Agriculture and Food Systems, and it talks a little bit about open-ended case inquiries, as well as some of the other ways we approach teaching food systems. I think you'll find complementary to what I've described here, and in a little bit more depth. So thank you so much for your time. I hope this is helpful and of use, and I wish you all the best.